Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Until recently, United States crude production had been on a steady decline. In 1970, domestic production peaked at 9.6 million barrels a day. By 2008, we're producing almost half. Only 5 million barrels were being pumped per day. Then America did what America does best. It innovated. New technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing ushered in an American energy revolution. Because of drilling in places like the Bakken and Eagle Ford, U.S. crude production has increased 56% since 2008. Some experts even believe that the United States will become the largest crude producer in the world by next year. But not all is good news. The oil being found in these places is light, sweet crude. Unfortunately, the majority of the refineries connected to the production sites are built to handle heavy, sour crude. We need new refineries, new pipelines to be built to process the light crude, but of course that will take years. In the meantime, we should sell our light crude abroad to those who want to buy it. That would bring billions of dollars and thousands of jobs into the economy of the United States. It is an obvious solution for a simple problem. Unfortunately, the federal government seems to be in the way again. In 1975, the Energy Policy and Conservation Act was passed, making it illegal to export United States crude. It was at the height of the Arab oil embargo. Congress wanted to insulate Americans from global price shocks and conserve domestic oil reserves. In reality, this ban achieved neither of those goals. The ban has not insulated United States consumers from the world market. Domestic gasoline prices are largely set by the global crude price, not domestic price, since crude is globally traded commodity. The United States still has to import about 46% of our crude. These imports face market uncertainty just like every other traded good. Lifting the ban is what would actually protect domestic consumers. U.S. crude on the world market decreases the market share of bad actors like Iran and unstable countries like Algeria. U.S. crude exports could also lower the price at the pump. More supply with the same amount of demand means a lower price. A recent study by ICF International found that lifting the ban would lower gas prices 2.3 cents per gallon. That may not sound like a lot, but remember Americans consume 133 billion gallons a year. So put it all together and Americans would save about $3 billion a year. Banning crude exports has not protected domestic reserves, it has stifled them. For producers to want to drill, they have to have a profit or make a profit. The crude export ban has driven the domestic price of crude so low that producers will not be able to make money off the drilling. If something isn't done, economists predict the drilling will slow in the next 18 to 36 months. Perfectly good oil will sit in the ground because the government restrictions are in the way. If domestic production companies are forced to cut back on drilling, they are going to also be forced to lay off American workers. On the other hand, if we promote a smart energy policy, we will increase production and grow these valuable jobs. So today we're going to examine the crude oil export ban and its implications for the United States economy. And the real question before us is, will lifting the ban, 1, help the United States economy, 2, lower gasoline prices, 3, have a positive impact on American consumers? We have differences of opinion on these answers to these questions, and that's why we're having the hearing. So I now recognize our ranking member from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having these hearings. We've had several hearings on the export of natural gas, both in the subcommittee and at the full committee. I believe this is the first to focus on the export of petroleum. These are dramatically different economic situations. That's because you can ship a barrel of oil most of the way around the world for maybe 1% of its value, whereas natural gas to liquefy, transport, and then regasify, you're talking about 40% of its value. There are some bottlenecks because every barrel of oil produced in the United States, with the exception of some on the Alaska North Slope and 25,000 barrels of heavy crude from California, has to find its way to the U.S. market. And so there could be problems of a short-term nature, and you could see 1% wasted effort as we transport Alaskan crude to U.S. markets, when it might be more efficient to transport Alaskan crude to Asian markets and import more from Africa or the Middle East. As we focus on the possibility of exports, I think a number of questions arise. First, what it will do to jobs, particularly in the shipping industry. We now have a requirement that domestically shipped oil has to be shipped on U.S. flag, U.S. crude, that is to say staffed ships, but not necessarily ships built in the United States. Do we want to go further and require that the ships be built here, and how important is that for our national security to have the infrastructure of U.S. shipbuilding and a merchant marine? We also have to look at whether we can require U.S. ships be used for the export of oil to Asian markets. Another issue that comes up is the possibility of free trade agreements. We already see that free trade agreements with regard to natural gas indicate that it is automatically considered in the national interest to allow exports of natural gas to countries that we have free trade agreements with. Will the same apply to petroleum? Will the same apply to the Trans-Pacific Partnership currently under negotiation? And under those trade agreements, will we be able to require U.S. flagships, ships with U.S. crews, U.S.-built ships? To me, the most important thing in allowing export is what will happen if there's a worldwide shortage or a market disruption. Why do we ban the export of U.S. crude? We did it in 1975 because we lived through 1973. And I think that we want to be in a situation where it is both legal and practical to require that U.S. crude be used only in the United States during a period that resembles 1973, when there's a shortage, a market disruption, a boycott, or gas lines from some other source. For that, we can put that in law, so it's legal if the president declares a disruption of world petroleum markets, but it also has to be practical. What will be the effect on our foreign relationships if in the middle of a worldwide shortage we stop oil tankers in the middle of the Pacific and require them to return to U.S. ports? What will be the practical effect of bringing that oil back, knowing that we will have built infrastructure on the idea that the U.S. will both export and import petroleum, and now all of a sudden we're hoarding our own production for our own purposes? So I look forward to trying to resolve these problems, because it's bad for our economy and bad for our environment to transport oil further than it would otherwise need to go, or to mismatch produced oil with the refinery capacity. And I think it's in the interests of the environment not to have to transport oil further than it would otherwise have to go. Every ship is producing greenhouse gases. So I look forward to learning, especially from the U.S. Senator who's come to educate us, and look forward to the opening statements of others.
I will now turn to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Royce from California, for his opening comments.
Well, thank you, Chairman Poe. I think you're holding a very important hearing at a very important time here as we start to think strategically about what it means in a world in which the United States increasingly has the capacity to ship oil to allies that are really under a great deal of pressure, and how that could be used as part of our diplomatic efforts, as part of our efforts, for example, with Iran to maintain sanctions. One of the things that I think should give us pause is that in our efforts to deny the regime in Tehran nuclear weapons capability, the United States and our European allies levied devastating sanctions against Iran by doing one thing, primarily in the original bill, and that was targeting their ability to export oil. And that severely limited their crude oil sales and denied them the ability to repatriate hard currency from those sales. Now, these sanctions against Iranian crude are often described as Iran's Achilles heel. Yet we're imposing the same kinds of sanctions on our own country if you think through what we've done, because we are basically at a point where without the crude export relief valve, oil companies will pull back on what will be increasingly uneconomic production. And the relief valve here is one that we could have used more effectively with respect to our allies, because there were 5 of our allies that were still taking oil shipments from Iran. We could have supplied that differential. We could have brought additional pressure to bear. And should, again, this situation in Iran not be solved in ensuing months or years, my hope is that we will have the capacity to think about what we could do in order to step in. At the same time, the Russian annexation of the Crimean Peninsula was made easier by its energy grip over Eastern Europe and especially over Ukraine. Russia has large oil and gas reserves, not as large as ours. They don't produce as much as we do, but almost as much. And it accounts for 70% of their trade and 52% of the budget for Russia that goes to support their military and their government. The crisis in Crimea has done little to dampen Russian oil sales, and Putin is freely selling oil and gas around the world, and especially in Eastern Europe, at monopoly prices, and thus has, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of influence there. As we look at our strategies for the future, and I'm going to quote General Martin Dempsey here, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he says, as we look at our strategies for the future, I think we've got to pay more and particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power. And I think that has to be factored in to the equation here. If we increase our supply of oil, especially into Eastern Europe, we will dent Russia's leverage on other countries and reduce the revenues that fund Russia's aggression. So, in addition, I think there's another point here, and it's a wider point, and it has to do with our domestic manufacturing and making certain that when practical, we take oil from our allies, such as Canada, because we are less susceptible to risk, political risk, than to the extent that we're reliant upon others. That's reason one. And reason two is because if we don't have that pipeline built from Canada, that pipeline will be built, but it will be built west to Vancouver, and that oil will be shipped to our economic competitor. So I believe the President should also stop blocking that long-delayed Keystone XL pipeline, which would create, I think all of us agree, at least 20,000 direct jobs. There may be a disagreement on the number of indirect jobs. We think it's several hundred thousand, and would enhance our energy security in partnership with Canada, our closest ally, one of our most reliable allies. And this is an opportunity not to be missed, an opportunity to reduce our vulnerability to political decisions and events in unfriendly countries that are also unstable. Yet our Secretary of State is conducting yet another review, and this one on the national security impacts of the pipeline, which will only further delay the project. So the time is now to end our self-imposed sanctions on energy exports to our allies. America leads the world with our dynamic and innovative energy sector. It's time we let it benefit our economy and our global security interests, and frankly, do something to decrease our deficits, and frankly, increase the Russian deficit right now. So thank you.
Thank the Chairman. Chair will recognize Mr. Vargas from California for 1 minute in his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. My question really is, how does this affect consumers in the United States? My understanding is that we have about, I believe, 17 million barrels a day in refining capacity. Obviously, we're not producing that much oil. There is a difference between sweet and the stuff you get here and from other places, but why can't we figure out a way to refine that here? That is my question. I did read the information here, and it seems to say, some say that if we do ship a lot of this oil abroad, that our prices will go up, and obviously that'll affect our consumers. But I think that the general question is, you know, we're producing it here. Why can't we refine it here? I mean, we figured out how to get it out of the ground. Isn't there a simple way to refine this stuff? Those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that all of the witnesses keep their presentation to no more than 5 minutes. Senator Lisa Murkowski is Alaska's senior senator, elected to the Senate in 2002. She is now the senior Republican member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee and also serves on the Senate Appropriations Committee, where she is the ranking Republican of the Interior and Environment Subcommittee. Senator Murkowski, thank you for being with us today. We know you have a busy schedule, and as soon as you have finished your statements, there will be no questions from members of the panel. And thank you for being with us. We'll hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today as you develop the record on an issue that I think is extraordinarily timely for our nation, and that is the issue of energy exports. And today, my comments will focus specifically on the export of oil, of crude. Again, I appreciate the invitation to kind of walk across the lawn here and share my perspective. I think it's fitting for both our chambers to be working together on issues, particularly issues such as energy exports that are so important to our nation and increasingly the world. I noted to you, Mr. Chairman, that in the Energy Committee we held a hearing on this issue several weeks ago. It was the first time in 25 years that there has been a hearing in the United States Senate on the issue of oil export. And put that into perspective, we haven't had the opportunity to talk about it because we have been evaluating our energy portfolio truly from one of scarcity rather than one of abundance, and how the landscape has changed. So this debate, this dialogue that you are beginning here in your committee is greatly appreciated and, again, very, very timely. Let there be no mistake that today's issue, the ban on crude oil exports, is truly one in the national interest. In an area of doubt, of debt and deficits, the North American energy renaissance presents us with an opportunity to strengthen our position and resolve on the global stage while generating wealth, creating jobs, reducing our deficits, and enhancing our national security. Lifting the ban will boost U.S. production and open our nation to global markets. The American consumer, the American people, are the ones that will ultimately benefit. And I appreciate Mr. Vargas's comment on the sensitivity to price. I come from a state, while we are producers, we also face some of the highest energy costs to consumers in the country. I have no interest in doing anything that will increase the price that Alaskans and others around the country pay. So I have been looking at this issue very, very critically. Existing regulations provide us some possibilities here. For example, a swap program with Canada was instituted by the Ford administration, continued by President Carter, and carried through to completion by President Reagan. There's been some discussion about similar opportunities with Mexico. That's something that I could support, but I think we have recognized that it is a somewhat cumbersome vehicle. So how would you deal with that? Last month, I proposed a roadmap for the way forward. I introduced a white paper on the broader issue of energy exports, but outlined in that white paper, as well as a speech to CERAWeek, how I think we might be able to advance. First, I believe that the Commerce Department retains the authority to modernize its regulations and update its 30-year definition of crude oil in such a way as to facilitate the export of condensate. Commerce has taken similar measures in the past. My committee staff has sketched out a report released earlier this week, and I would like to be able to provide that to the committee if I may. Among the many examples, let me highlight a couple here. During the era of price and allocation controls, California started to shut in production for a variety of competitive and regulatory reasons. Commerce authorized a temporary export program of residual fuel oil to protect the production. So when you've got an oversupply of butane, a glut was effectively created in the Gulf Coast, additional exports were authorized by Commerce. So we do have in place existing authorities. Now, I have asked the Energy Information Administration, the EIA, to conduct an ongoing dynamic analysis of the crude oil export situation. What I don't want to see is a standalone static study that would be out of date by the time that it is published. I suggested in my speech in Houston that this might be the year of the reports. 2014 would be the year that we do this assessment, the analysis, the real in-depth, get an in-depth understanding as to where we are with oil exports. Finally, Mr. Chairman, the President retains the authority to approve limited crude oil exports. We know this because presidents from both parties have done so in the past. Now, one objection I have heard is that this approach cedes too much authority to the President. How, it is asked, can one both criticize the administration for misusing executive power in some areas, but ask it to take action here? The answer is pretty simple. The answer is that Congress has already given explicit authority to the President to address oil exports for the national interest. So at the end of the day, I am prepared to introduce legislation if necessary, but because legislation takes time that we may not need to spend, I'm hopeful that we may have a willing partner within the administration. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have exceeded my time. I do have, again, information that my staff on the Energy Committee has gone into great detail in laying out what we think might be a reasonable path forward. It also outlines the authorities that are currently in law for the administration, but I do think it is part of the initial discussion as we take on this very important and very timely issue.
Thank you, Senator, and we'll make the information you give the subcommittee a part of the record.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll have our next panel seated at the table. I want to welcome our second panel to this hearing. I will give an introduction of each of you, and then you will be given 5 minutes. We have your written statements as part of the record, so don't exceed 5 minutes or I will gavel you. Mr. Mike Jennings is Chairman and President of the Chief Executive Officer of Holly Frontier Corporation, a major U.S. refinery. He's also Director of Holly Frontier and Holly Logistics Services. Mr. Jennings served as Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Frontier Oil Corporation until its merger with Holly Corporation in 2011. From 2005 to 2009, he was Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Frontier Oil. Mr. Eric Mulito is the Director of Upstream and Industry Operations for the American Petroleum Institute, a national trade association representing more than 500 companies involved in all aspects of the oil and gas industry. Prior to his current position, he served as managing counsel for API, and he's testified before the House and the Senate multiple times. Dr. Kenneth Medlock III is the James A. Baker and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics at Rice University. He's also the Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, Adjunct Professor and Lecturer in the Department of Economics. He's also Vice President for the Conferences for the United States Association for Energy Economics. Ms. Deborah Gordon is Senior Associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in their Energy and Climate Program. Her policy research focuses on oil, climate change, energy, and transportation issues in North America and globally. Previously, she managed an active energy and environmental consulting practice and served as co-director of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Transportation and Environment programs from 1996 to 2000. I want to welcome all of you here. Mr. Jennings, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Mike Jennings, and I represent HollyFrontier Corporation. We're a domestic independent refining company. We operate 5 petroleum refineries in the Central and Rocky Mountain states. We employ about 2,600 people directly, and indirectly a number that's probably 10 times that many associated with our contracted maintenance work. Our company is a merchant refining company. That means that we buy crude oil from those that produce it. We also have a wholesale marketing strategy, so our products are distributed through convenience stores and big box retailers, none of which bear our name. But our products go out to a market that's in the center of the United States. We produce about 2.5% of the nation's gasoline, diesel, and related petroleum products through our plants each day. As a merchant refiner, the key messages that I hope to convey to the committee today are as follows. Crude oil exports by the United States are likely to raise domestic crude prices and increase retail gasoline prices in the markets that our company serves by an estimated 10 to 15 cents per gallon of gasoline. Crude exports on the part of a country that imports nearly half of its crude oil requirements are, in our view, very unlikely to improve energy security or advance national interest, as we will simply make ourselves more dependent upon crude oil imports as we export our own crude. And we need to be thoughtful about the nations from whom we would be importing that crude. Those with surplus are the OPEC producers and Russia. Third, the U.S. refining and petrochemical sector is a major employer and is making hundreds of billions of dollars of new investments over the next 10 years to increased manufacturing processing capacity along the Gulf Coast and in other places in order to manufacture and convert this wealth of new raw material that is being produced in the upstream. And finally, there are many elements of U.S. energy policy that conflict with free trade objectives, including the Renewable Fuel Standard, presidential approvals for key import infrastructure, the Jones Act shipping requirements, and particularly that RFS. These should be considered alongside any consideration of opening trade to crude oil exports in an effort to make free trade more possible within the U.S. petroleum and products sector. As a merchant refiner, we're intensely aware of the impact of increased production of crude in the United States. We believe that this expanded production has helped in terms of our nation's energy security. But though great strides have been made, the United States remains very dependent upon imported crude. This is not my opinion or the opinion of our company, simply a statement of facts. Current refining requirements are approximately 17 million barrels a day, while domestic crude production was about 7.5 million barrels per day in 2013. That's projected to increase by 1 million barrels in 2014, but we're still at about 50% of our requirements. Supporters of lifting a ban on the crude exports argue that such a decision would make a move toward a freer global supply, and certainly our company supports the development of freer energy markets. However, we have to be conscious of the fact that the global crude market is not occupied by free trade. It's dominated by OPEC, which is a cartel, and the country of Russia. Neither of these entities have free trade at their hearts. They're protecting their own domestic interests in cartel setting volume requirements and other behavior. So though American crude production has increased dramatically, it's not yet matured to the point where we believe it would significantly impact the global price of crude were it to be available to be exported. In addition, the non-free trade elements of Renewable Fuel Standards, Jones Act, and other limitations on import infrastructure are still very significant impediments to free trade within the energy sector. I spoke in my earlier about the impact of pricing on U.S. gasoline in the face of potential crude oil exports. And our company's view of that is there's probably a 10 to 20 cent per gallon uplift in the cost of gasoline, again, in the markets that we serve, which would result from this policy decision. We take that by observing markets that are served by waterborne crude, principally that of New York Harbor, Southern California, and Northwest Europe. And if we look at those gasoline prices, wholesale, pre-tax, against the prices that are traded in our markets supplied by domestic crude, we're seeing a 10 to 20 cent differential, with customers in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas paying the lower number. We think that's something that the committee should take into consideration. I've exceeded my time, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Mr. Melito, you have 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the committee. I'm Eric Melito, Upstream Director at the American Petroleum Institute. API has 600 members at this point. You mentioned 500, and got news today that we're now over 600. We represent the full supply chain, from exploration and production to pipeline and midstream, as well as the refining sector. Today, America is producing nearly 50% more oil than we did in 2008. By 2015, the International Energy Agency predicts the U.S. will surpass Saudi Arabia and Russia to be the world's top crude oil producer. Development of resources from unconventional formations through the use of hydraulic fracturing now supports more than 2 million jobs, and this is projected to rise to nearly 4 million jobs by 2025. This is clearly a new era for American energy, but our energy trade policies are stuck in the 1970s. It's time to unlock the benefits of trade for U.S. consumers and further strengthen our position as a global energy superpower. This week, API released a new study, submitted for the record today, on the economic implications of lifting the trade restrictions that prevent exports of U.S. crude oil to global markets. This is the most detailed analysis on the wide range of economic benefits, and it paints a compelling picture. Consumers are among the first to benefit from free trade, and crude oil is no exception. Gasoline costs are tied to a global market, and this study shows that additional exports could help increase supplies, put downward pressure on the prices at the pump here in the U.S., and bring more jobs to America. The ICF analysis reaches several key conclusions, which are important to understanding the benefits that lifting the restrictions on crude exports will have on our nation. Among other things, the cost of gasoline, heating oil, and diesel fuel is projected to fall, saving American consumers up to $5.8 billion per year on average between 2015 and 2035. The U.S. economy could gain up to 300,000 additional jobs in 2020. U.S. oil production could increase by as much as 500,000 barrels per day in 2020, and U.S. refiners could process, on average, an additional 100,000 barrels of oil per day due to more efficient distribution of heavy and light crudes over the 2015 to 2035 period. Harnessing these benefits, however, will require lawmakers and regulators to re-examine policies that were enacted long before the U.S. transitioned from a period of energy scarcity to our current position, one of energy abundance. Our industry also believes it's important that we work holistically to modernize America's energy infrastructure and facilitate the efficient flow of resources from producer to refiner and to customer. This study corrects some of the misperceptions about the energy market that are often repeated by critics of free trade. Chief among those is the impact on consumers. Consumers don't buy crude oil, they buy fuel. And the prices of refined products, like gasoline, are set by a global market. A temporary glut of oil in one region doesn't significantly lower consumer costs because gasoline is eligible for trade after the oil is refined. If oil can flow to the global market, this study shows that then you begin to see higher global supplies, more production, and consumer-level benefits, as well as more American jobs. Of course, there are also the strategic reasons to increase U.S. energy exports. Mr. Royce alluded to this quote, but I think it's worth repeating. It's from General Martin Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he recently said, "An energy independent and net exporter of energy as a nation has a potential to change the security environment around the world, notably in Europe and in the Middle East. And so, as we look at our strategies for the future, I think we've got to pay more and particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power. General Dempsey then added that energy could become one of our more prominent tools for national security. If we grow as an exporter, U.S. energy leadership has the potential to bolster America's allies, expand our geopolitical influence, and strengthen the global energy market against future disruptions. However, the first step is lifting our own self-imposed restrictions. And as we can see in today's study, the benefits will flow to consumers and workers here in the U.S., where the argument in favor of free trade is undeniable. Thank you again to the chairman and to the committee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Medlock, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, a lot of what Mr. Melito said is actually supported to a certain extent by some work that we've been involved with. We recently launched a study looking at the broader impacts of allowing oil exports from the United States, and that's actually a smaller part of a broader study that we're looking at to evaluate North American energy security prospects. So this is the idea of regional trade being allowed to flow freely between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and what sort of benefits that could actually convey. In general, when you look at commodity trade, you're talking about, when you talk about oil in particular, and this will address gasoline prices, a market between oil and gasoline that's vertically integrated effectively. So we use oil to produce gasoline. So if you pinch one market or constrain one market, the arbitrage opportunity moves downstream to the next one. And so what this means is if we constrain the flow of exports of crude oil, what we'll see is a discount domestically, and that's exactly what we've seen. But as long as the product price is arbitraged internationally, then you'll see that price fluctuate according to international supply-demand fundamentals. And so that's exactly what we've seen. And if you look at pad-level data for gasoline prices in the United States and other petroleum product prices, you do see that disconnect is transmitted in so much as we've seen, for example, in the ability to move crude away from WTI. Now, of course, historically, over the last few years, this has not been an export-driven issue. This has been an infrastructure-driven issue. But that disconnect, nevertheless, has led to a discount of WTI relative to Brent. And you see that disconnect or that discount being conveyed from WTI into product prices. And so what that means is the product prices are not falling coincidentally with WTI. So what that tells you is that refiners, in fact, are not passing the price, the discount along. Now, that sounds like a really sort of almost negative statement, but in point of fact, what we're talking about is we have downstream a market that is internationally fungible, and that is a really critical point. So what that means is that the price movements internationally will affect the product price movements here, not the domestic crude price. And again, this is just a standard sort of protocol when you start to look at how commodity prices are influenced by different market behaviors and market constraints. Now, when you move beyond understanding what might happen to gasoline prices, and importantly, it's sort of logical to follow the step. Well, what happens if we lift the ban on crude oil exports? And the next logical step would be, well, you're actually pushing more light tight oil or light sweet crude into the global marketplace, and presumably that could actually put downward pressure on the price of light sweet crude, which is, that's the barrel at the margin. So that is the barrel that's helping determine the price of products. The problem with making a just sort of grand statement like that is that qualitatively, while that's true, quantitatively it's difficult to assess because there will be market responses by other participants. In particular, you can't predict exactly what OPEC will do. The one thing we can say for certain, though, because there really is no paradigm in any sort of economic principles or economic framework that I can think of in which allowing exports of crude oil into the international market actually raise the price of crude oil. That simply won't happen. But point estimates on declines, that's a difficult thing to do. With regard to energy security, because this is another really major sort of broader issue that kind of fits into the context overall of something I mentioned a minute ago about North American energy security. It's go back to the 1970s. You mentioned in your opening statements about the acts that were actually passed to sort of ban the export of crude oil. Well, when you do this, you quickly begin to realize that, while well-intentioned, those policies didn't necessarily convey the benefits that they were meant to convey. In particular, when you look at a very deep literature on this issue, and why do we think about energy security in the context of oil prices? Well, because every recession except for one since World War II has been preceded by a run-up in the price of crude oil. Just a very standard, simple correlation. Now, it doesn't convey causation, but the idea is you want to shield consumers domestically from shocks related to macroeconomic shocks that could be related to run-ups in the price of crude. Well, one of the things that actually falls out of the literature are a number of different potential channels through which prices transmit to the macroeconomy, and one of these is through the trade balance. And so if you actually allow for exports of light sweet crude, which is a higher valued crude slate than the heavy sours that we typically import into the Gulf Coast, for example, you're actually giving a net positive benefit to the trade balance, and actually conveys an energy security benefit, not necessarily an energy security cost. So these sorts of things have to be brought into discussion. These are the kinds of things that we're actually actively looking at right now in order to try to really understand what changing the existing paradigm or the status quo will mean longer term, not only for gasoline prices, but more broadly for U.S. energy security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Medlick. Ms. Gordon.
Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Sherman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for allowing me to testify today. In my remarks, I want to talk about 3 key points: the changing conditions influencing today's oil market, the divide amongst stakeholders on whether to export crude or whether the ban should be lifted, and the need to deal with environmental consequences from oil exports. I explore these issues in greater detail in my written comments submitted for the record. The bottom line is that managing the U.S.'s newfound oil abundance will require careful analysis and strategy. Many opportunities and challenges lie ahead. As the U.S. oil production ramps up to peaks not seen since 1970, the key policy question is whether to reverse a 40-year oil decision to ban U.S. crude oil exports. In my judgment, the right answer is not yes or no. The situation is far more complex than those in favor or those against lifting the U.S. crude oil ban suggest. And as policymakers debate this ban and whether it should be lifted, it's important to address 3 questions. The first question is, given that the U.S. can already export unlimited volumes of petroleum products, under what conditions should it also be allowed to export crude oil? Over the past 8 years, U.S. petroleum product exports have increased 4-fold. Last year in 2013, the U.S. exported about $150 billion in petroleum products, scoring the largest gain for any commodity in the U.S. economy. Reversing the crude oil export ban could significantly increase rising U.S. oil exports. A go-slow policy on oil exports is needed to allow the U.S. and other nations to adjust to North America's increased oil capacity. Those oil-rich nations that have built their economies around oil revenue are increasingly vulnerable to disruption. It is unclear how the oil value chain will adjust in response to changes in upstream production and downstream refining factors. Fostering market stability should be a primary consideration in deciding what conditions should apply to the U.S. in terms of future crude and petroleum product exports. Question 2, who would benefit most from reversing the U.S. oil export ban? The oil value chain is made up of an increasingly diverse array of players, processes, oils, and products. And public information is lacking to independently assess the situation. As such, determining who benefits from exporting crude oil is not simple. Opinions vary widely and may not align with U.S. policymakers' overall goals. For example, oil producers and leaseholders strongly advocate lifting the ban. Refiners are split as to whether or not to lift the ban, depending on numerous operational and geographic factors that determine their bottom lines. Manufacturers do not yet appear to have a unified position. American consumers are most concerned about prices at the gas pump, and industry analysts like Woodmac argue that crude markets are complicated and relaxing the oil export ban could invite cost-cutting arbitrage of U.S. and international crudes with unpredictable outcomes. Question 3, could unconditional exporting of U.S. crudes have unintended environmental consequences? How the U.S. and global oils are managed through imperfect markets and various policy directives creates significant uncertainties. As the U.S. debates lifting its crude oil export ban, carbon emissions are already flowing throughout the marketplace in a highly fluid fashion. The energy sector will have to adapt to climate change, both in the resilience of its existing assets and also in terms of the durability of its investments. The situation the U.S. is confronting on how to manage North American oil boom raises serious climate questions for America as to its, 1, climate responsibility as both a producer and a consumer, its capacity, our capacity to create market transparency on a growing array of oils, and I cannot stress enough how different these oils are from one another, and 3, policy leadership to efficiently cut carbon out of the oil value chain. In sum, the right question is not whether or not to eliminate the U.S. crude oil ban. Exporting U.S. oil is part of a much larger and more important picture. The burning question is whether America can manage the economic, security, and climate impacts of its new oil bounty. As one of the world's fastest growing oil producers, the U.S. has the opportunity and responsibility to be a global leader in the energy sector. A strong, balanced energy policy is needed to guide energy decision-making in ways that satisfy the energy needs of consumers, strengthen the U.S. economy, protect the climate, and enhance national and global energy security. Guided by congressional leadership, a comprehensive policy framework is needed to deliver on a promise of America's new energy abundance. Thank you.
I want to thank all our panelists. I'll yield 5 minutes to myself for questions. Mr. Medlock, Mr. Jennings on your far right there runs a refinery. He says it's going to cost him 10 to 15 cents more to refine gasoline if we lift the ban. What do you think about that?
Well, I think undoubtedly if we lift the ban, domestic price of crude will go up, and so that will actually affect the bottom line of any refinery, particularly those that are processing light sweet crude. So the cost to refine crude will certainly rise, but the price of the finished products themselves are still going to be determined in our national marketplace. It's fully fungible because there are no barriers to trade there.
All right, let me be more specific. He said gasoline prices at his refinery would go up 10 to 15 cents if we lift the ban. And he'd lay off, I forget how many workers. He mentioned a lot of workers. So weigh in on that. And keep it simple, Mr. Medlock. Your testimony is complicated. Keep it simple.
Fair enough. Fair enough. The issue, in all fairness, though, is not quite so simple. But in point of fact, we export products today, and we see healthier margins today at refineries because not only do we have cheap crude domestically because of the onset of production that we've seen in the last 4 to 5 years. But we also have cheap natural gas, which actually helps the bottom line of refineries. And we also have an excess of refining capacity relative to what we consume because demand today is lower than it was in 2006, 2007, and 2008. All three of those things, coupled with the closure of refineries overseas, have really helped propel the U.S. refining industry into a sort of new paradigm, one in which we're actually exporting as much finished product today as we did just back in 2006, or in terms of what we imported in 2006. So when you look at that and you combine all those factors together, yes, exporting crude oil will raise the price of crude oil to refineries, but those other benefits are still there. So it's not clear to me that refiners will actually be forced to shut down. Their bottom lines will be affected. But whether or not they close and end up laying people off is a completely different issue.
Mr. Melito, I have a couple of questions for you. The chairman mentioned the Keystone XL pipeline and the glut of crude oil coming into the United States. How would that affect any of this, if it would?
It's huge. We're looking to have a market in North America that works efficiently together. And a lot of the refiners, particularly in the Gulf Coast, have reconfigured and made upgrades to take on the heavier crudes. That would naturally come through the Keystone XL pipeline from our friendly trading partner to the north. So infrastructure is a very important component of this whole debate, and we need to make sure we're moving forward in a way to capitalize on these infrastructure opportunities because they alone create a lot of jobs. Our country is projected over the next 12 or 13 years to put more than $1 trillion into infrastructure projects because of this oil and gas renaissance. So we shouldn't turn our eye to that opportunity.
The Keystone XL pipeline is supposed to come down to Port Arthur, Texas. I used to represent all those refineries. Mr. Weber now represents them all.
Amen.
But let me ask you another question about the Middle East, kind of a policy, and anybody can weigh in on this. So we lift the ban, so to speak. How does that affect us energy-wise and politically with the Middle East? Because that's, when we talk about the Middle East, everybody talks about making them irrelevant, because of their situation, but they hold a lot of the crude oil we get. Politically and economically, would this affect our relationship with the Middle East? Anybody can weigh in on this.
Well, I'm sure Dr. Medlock has some input on that, but one thing I would point to is the need for us as a nation to look at energy security and link it to foreign policy. Those two need to be addressed holistically, and from just a fundamental standpoint, if we are taking down the walls that we have that are right now up along our coast to exports, whether it's LNG, crude oil, we are sending a pretty strong signal to those around the world that we're going to play as an energy superpower like we should. So we're sending a signal, and we're also putting more supplies into the marketplace. and creating a better scenario. The production we've had in this huge increase where we've gone from 5 to 8 million barrels a day has allowed the global market to be able to absorb and have a greater cushion when you're looking at things like Iran sanctions and things like that. So it's a huge benefit to energy security when we're able to push more supplies into the global market. But like I said, I think Dr. Medlock probably has a lot smarter answer than that.
And also, Dr. Medlock, while you're answering that question, I've always thought that the United States, Canada, and Mexico, we ought to work together on energy issues, energy independence, energy security, economically. Are we doing that any better than we have in the past? Make it quick if you can, please.
Yeah, great question. On the issue of the Middle East, they will never be irrelevant. It's too large an energy exporter into the global marketplace, and we're not the only consumer in the world. So when you talk about a globally interconnected marketplace, they're going to matter no matter what we do. With regard to U.S., Canada, and Mexico, I would say we're not actually optimizing the relationships that we have with Canadians and the Mexicans. And we're presented with some actually new real opportunities, and one of those north of the border would be with regard to the development of the oil sands production opportunities and moving that oil via pipeline instead of by rail or somewhere else where it's actually going to be at a cost disadvantage relative to moving it here. So it's going to be more polluting, which ironically is exactly what is trying to be prevented. So with regard to Mexico, in terms of what's happening with energy reform there's tremendous opportunity to deepen the energy trade relationship with that country, particularly as it begins to open up their upstream sector to foreign investment.
Thank you. I will yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
A number of our witnesses talk about energy abundance, quote General Dempsey about how we're going to have world power by being a net energy exporter. I think we're getting a little carried away. It's nice to be producing more, but the chances that we export more petroleum than we import are roughly the same as the Vladimir Putin winning a Nobel Peace Prize. We're talking here about a country that's going to be importing more than it exports for a long, long time to come. I'm going to pose one question for the record just because I don't know if you've come here to, you're prepared to answer it, and that is, we could export 1 billion barrels and import 1 billion barrels, and maybe that, it'd say, hey, that's about the same. Except it offers an opportunity to play tax shenanigans with both the billion coming in and the billion going out. So what are the opportunities for U.S. energy producers to classify their income as earned in the Cayman Islands or Switzerland on these exports? And could this be a game where we're just kind of moving things around, it doesn't have much effect, except we lose an awful lot of tax revenue? I'm also going to be posing that question to people who are tax experts as well. But if the major effect of this is to introduce tax shenanigans into moving 1 billion barrels from here to there and from there to here, I think we ought to be very wary of that. Now, it's my understanding that we can export refined petroleum products without legal restriction. Is that correct? I'm seeing nodding. Most natural resource producers in the world say, we don't want to just have you come here and take our potash. We don't want to just have you come here and mine this or that. We want the manufacturing, or at least the processing jobs. Why can we not achieve what we want to achieve just by keeping the refinery creation and operation jobs here and exporting the refined product? Why do we need to be exporting the petroleum? Ms. Gordon?
So about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, before light tight oil was really on anyone's radar screen, and even EIA missed it, everyone missed it. And there are reasons why separately I can discuss, but the move was made to change the entire refining sector to deal with what oil we thought was going to be the last oil on earth, this heavier barrel. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a situation where billions have been put into U.S. refineries all up and down the Mississippi and into the Gulf that handle selectively best they're complex refineries, and they handle the extra heavy oil. There are
So we would want to somehow acquire heavy oil for those refineries.
yes, and the prospects for Canada.
And whether we burn that ourselves or whether we export the refined product, we want to keep those special refineries refining what they were built for.
And those refineries make diesel. They make more diesel, and diesel, goes to your question, has a very high export value. We're exporting a tremendous amount of diesel. The light tight oils that now we found out we have, and we don't really yet have the refining capacity for, make preferentially gasoline, which is the product we use. So you can imagine ships crossing in the night, you know, with all of this global trade where oil will go one way, it will get refined someplace else, the product will come back.
How dangerous is it to transport refined petroleum products?
I think it's just more a matter of what you're saying before, economic value. There's always a risk whenever you're putting
But
things.
it's no more dangerous than, I mean, we know unrefined petroleum can stain beaches. I assume that the refined petroleum is not explosive.
No, it would be the same contamination that you would have if it opened up on, although the extra heavy oil might be very different. When it spilled into the Mississippi, you know, the extra heavy oil sinks. So it's a little bit different.
Well, real quickly on that, the recent incident in Galveston in the Houston Ship Channel was related to a fuel oil spill. That was a refined product spill. So, and in terms of the cost of transporting of products, it is different because the flash points are different for refined products than they are for raw crudes. And so, this goes back to the point about, you remember the train incident that happened.
But we're talking about $1 a barrel difference or 20
Oh,
cents
it's not
a barrel
huge.
difference? Okay.
The
That's
biggest
very,
cost
very
is,
small
the
compared
biggest
to the
cost
value
that Barbara was
the product.
talking, Ms. Gordon was talking about was really related to stranded costs that refiners would be forced to deal with if they're forced to actually go in and reconfigure to handle the crudes that are being produced here.
My time has expired.
Thank the ranking member. We'll turn to Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Just a myriad of questions here. I just want to maybe go back to this last question about refined as opposed to unrefined. It seems to me that the refined product would be more dangerous maybe to the environment if it would spill as opposed to crude oil that comes from the ground, comes from the earth. But if I'm wrong, am I wrong? Or makes no difference whatsoever. We don't care whether we spill gasoline or oil, or crude oil. It's all the same.
Generally,
Well, it's all
refined
hydrocarbon.
product will evaporate if spilled, and crude oil will not. So there is a difference.
But which one's worse?
Well, worse to the water would be the crude oil, which would be residual in the water. Worse to the air would be.
Doesn't it come out of the ground on the California coast, the crude oil? Doesn't it bubble up out of the surface of the ocean? So,
There's a difference between a naturally occurring seep and a spill. A naturally occurring seep is actually part of a local ecosystem that has evolved over thousands of years typically, whereas when you talk about a spill, it's an introduction of a raw crude into an area that's not equipped to cope with it. So it is different.
okay.
And I just wanted to add, because oils are now so different from each other, we still talk about it as oil coming out of the ground, but the light tight oils, some of them, especially coming out of Eagle Ford in Texas, are so light, they're condensate. And that's what Senator Murkowski was talking about, maybe trying to change the definition of oil. And some of the oils coming out of the ground in Venezuela and Canada are so heavy, they're on their way to coal. So we're talking about the definition of oil, hydrocarbons, really changing, where it's not necessarily one thing anymore. It's a collective of a lot of different hydrocarbon arrangements.
Okay. Can anybody talk to the questions regarding some of the boutique fuels that the federal government requires refiners to make? Is there any difference or any considerations in that regarding exporting, importing light crude, heavy, sour, sweet, and our refining capacity in the United States?
The refining system in the United States is obviously capable of making the different boutique fuels that are required in different markets throughout the country. They relate to principally the vapor pressure, how volatile the material is, octane, and now sulfur content is a big focus. The international standard often requires the tighter end of those specifications, and so the export barrels typically will be those that would qualify for the most stringent U.S. markets as well.
At what point in this discussion are producers going to leave the oil in the ground? Are we already doing that because refining capacity doesn't exist? Is that already occurring now? And if it isn't, at what point would that occur? Will it never occur?
It will certainly occur if the discounts actually get to be sufficient enough. I mean, currently, and there are a couple of different things that are working against this. It's not just an export issue, it's also an infrastructure issue because currently in the Bakken, for example, in North Dakota, we move a lot of that crude by rail, which is an order of magnitude more expensive than moving it by pipeline. And this goes back to, getting the appropriate infrastructure in place, and there's obviously a policy overlay here. But if you were to actually have the pipeline infrastructure in place, that crude, effectively the net back to the wellhead, would be priced $18 to $20 higher. And so that buys a lot more activity in the field. So it's, I hate to focus this only on the export issue because it's broader than that. It actually is, it matriculates down in the infrastructure to move away from the wellhead. And moving crude by rail is a lot more expensive than moving it by pipe.
I was just going to add, because it came up, the consumers and the economy, of course, with oil and gasoline comes up all the time. These oils, if they're stranded in the ground, it will be because the price is too low. It will take a much higher price. So we're talking about more abundance at a high price. This is so different than the 1970s where we were talking very low prices and then supply was getting stuck. This is a lot of capacity, physical capacity of hydrocarbons in the earth that can get out of the ground if the price gets really high. So we'll see volatility in the market, but it's going to have to trend upward to get these oils out of the market and move them around and refine them.
And if I could add, looking at the study we have, it shows that with the lifting of the crude export restrictions, we could see additional production of up to 500,000 barrels. So just put two and two together. That's because there's now an opportunity because we have a new market to take that product to. But at the same time, that impact on production is pretty significant. You would see those jobs go into places like Pennsylvania, California, Texas, that are heavy in manufacturing and production. Not just production of oil, but also on the manufacturing side.
So we've got a couple refineries down in the Philadelphia area, Marcus Hook, that were in peril just a year or two ago. If refineries like the ones that you are familiar with, and those in particular in Pennsylvania, had to change around, what would be the time frame to change around to refine the oil that we're talking about coming out of the United States?
Well,
those refineries are very well suited to the light U.S. crudes that are being produced in the Bakken and other places, the condensates from the Marcellus and the Utica shales. They are at risk in the advent of crude exports, and the reason being, if it can go to the East Coast by rail or otherwise and load onto a ship at the Brent price, they're going to lose access to that advantaged barrel of crude oil. So they're sort of a poster child for reasons to retain that domestic U.S. manufacturing capacity and the security of being able to produce our own refined products versus export it.
And this is a very innovative industry, as we know, and that's a fantastic thing, actually. So these constraints lead to changes. BP is building the first splitter refinery in Houston that's going to be able to handle light tight oils and extra heavy oils. Exxon is building a refinery, a petrochemical refinery in Indonesia that's going to be able to handle the gamut of these oils. So somehow we're going to have to figure out how to manage all of these oils and not just kind of split up, or I would argue against changing the definition of oil, because you're going to have to deal with a whole array of hydrocarbons in the future.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
All right. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel. Appreciate your testimony. Mr. Jennings, you were saying oil price is dictated by OPEC. Is that correct? The OPEC market?
Significantly induced.
Is it possible for the U.S. to produce enough oil with our allies to set the world oil prices, breaking OPEC's monopoly?
I think that would take many years. The U.S. still imports 6-7 million barrels per day.
All right, but if we increased our production along with our allies, it's possible, right?
It is possible, yes.
Would breaking the OPEC's monopoly stabilize the sharp spikes we see, especially in the Middle East, when you have a ruler or a dictator, they get an upset stomach or gas, and they threaten to close one of the straits there? I mean, would that stabilize the price of oil?
Yeah, the Middle East is still producing and exporting 10 to 15 million barrels per day of oil. Even with what we and our North American allies could do, I don't believe in the near future, in our lifetimes, we're going to offset that effect.
But it's possible. And if we don't prepare, if I look back to when Bill Clinton was in office and he had the opportunity to build that pipeline, but he said that would take 10 years, wouldn't help us. That 10 years has come and gone by a factor of about 2.5 to 3. We would have had that extra stability in a supply that we do not have today. So if we prepare today, it would be possible in the future, correct?
Absolutely. The infrastructure and the production capacity is critical. I mean, if you take the other end of the spectrum, the Canadians are going to solve their own problem, and they'll go east to New Brunswick and off on a boat, or west to British Columbia to China.
And we don't want that.
And we don't want that. None of us want that.
We don't want that. We can't use oil or the petroleum products as a strategic diplomatic tool if we do not update our export oil policies. And I, for one, will support the repeal of this policy to increase the ability for us to export so that we can use that as a bargaining chip. Mr. Melito and Dr. Medlock, do you feel it's possible for us to achieve energy security in the U.S.?
I think we're doing that right now with this tremendous advance in production that we're seeing. You know, going from 5 million barrels a day to 10 million barrels a day in just a few years is incredible. Nobody would have ever imagined that. Same on the natural gas side. We're expected to import $100 billion a year in natural gas, and now we're looking to export. So,
well, I mean, that's just it. I mean, 10 years ago, we're going to have to export all this, but through technology and better techniques, we're going to be a net exporter. Do you feel like we could be a net exporter on petroleum products, too?
We're on our way there as well. If you look at the volume of petroleum refined product that we're moving now, that alone is having a huge dent on our trade deficit. So the refiners are performing at a high level, high capacity, and they're helping us on an energy security front.
All right, and moving crude by pipeline is more economical, it's more efficient. That's what you were saying, correct?
Yes.
Versus rail or truck?
It is much less expensive.
And if we moved it that way, it would be better for the environment, so we're not driving trains and trucks around, correct?
That's correct.
So do you see any reason not to build the pipeline?
No.
Thank you. Dr. Gordon, you said we should go slow at not upsetting the world producers to give them time to adjust. Would an increase in the supply stabilize the price, in your opinion? Microphone, please.
Sorry. What's happening in the U.S. is we're the biggest consumer, and now we're becoming a very big producer. So we're in the position of being the only nation on earth that's almost equal parts producer and consumer, which puts us in a very unusual situation compared to everyone else around the globe, which is either much more a producer or much more a consumer. You know, China, Saudi Arabia. So we just have, the go slow is to figure out what this means at home, you know, for us.
I think what it means to me is I sleep better at night knowing that we can produce our needs and where we're not dependent as much on foreign oil. And so I think the more we can do that, it would increase our security in the nation, stabilize our markets. Because what I see is I come from a strong agricultural background. Every time the price of oil goes up, and I remember when we were buying diesel for $5 a gallon in my truck, the price of everything went up immediately. And the sharp spikes are what disrupted the economy. If we can stabilize that with a steady supply from our allies to the north, and maybe Mexico, and we can stabilize that here, it'll stabilize our economy. And if we have a stabilized economy, we have an economic engine that we need to protect. Oil will be shipped where it's needed from countries that produce it to those where the market is needed. And if that's the case, I say if we have the market and we have the supply, I think we need to ship it because it'll create tax revenues for this country, and I think America can do it better than anybody else. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Cotton. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Wow. Did any of y'all know what the percentage of plants, there's about 130, 140 refineries across the country. Does that sound about right? What percentage of those refineries are set to do light crude, and what percentage are set to do just heavy crude, and then what percentage are set to do both?
First, I want to dispel the myth that it's just light or just heavy. Inside every heavy refinery is a light plant where you're going to not use the full kit, okay? So these plants can refine light crude, but not on an optimized basis. They don't fully use all the capital. Probably half to 5/8 of our country's refining capacity has capability to cut deeper into the heavy and sour barrel and make gasoline and diesel out of it, and the remaining 30–40% doesn't have that capacity. What I would say, though, is that's a snapshot at a point in time. There's a lot of investment being made, condensate splitters, other things that plants are doing. We had one in Cheyenne, Wyoming, that was almost 100% running heavy Canadian. Now we run 50% Canadian, 50% light Bakken. So I hope I answered your question quantitatively, but I want to leave you with the impression that things are changing because investments are being made toward the new light crude slate.
Right, right. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Yes, ma'am.
There's a new CRS report that just came out last week that actually has the map of the world, a map of the country broken down. It's very different by pad. You know, some districts are much better suited to, you know, the different types of refineries. But I have that. I could show it to you after if you want to see it.
Okay, and that was my next question. You're reading my notes up here, I guess. I hope that person's okay. It shows the map of the United States by location. Of course, I'm from the Texas Gulf Coast, as Judge Poe was saying, and the Keystone Pipeline does come into my district. And the discussion you're hearing is exactly correct. We can move oil safer, 99% safety rating via the pipeline industry, and we can produce it in Texas and export it if should the need arise. It's going to impact some of the refineries, Mr. Jennings. I get that. And I'm interested in that percentage, and of course I'm interested in what's in Texas and specifically what's in my district. One of you said we have excess refining capacity, and my question is how much?
Currently, the United States is exporting about 1.5 million barrels per day on a net basis of refined petroleum products.
We're exporting 1.5 million, but how much refining capacity does that give us? I'm not following.
Refineries are running in the low 90s in terms of their capacity. They might be able to eke out 2% additional, so that would be another 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day. What I would tell you is the refining system is fully utilized, but we are accessing about 1.5 million barrels a day to export markets for refined products.
Does that also include the pipeline? I know that we move product back and forth. If we get the Keystone Pipeline approved, does that increase our capacity?
That allows us to run different crude oil. It is a crude pipeline as opposed to a refined product pipeline.
I got you. And when we're running those pipelines, what we're seeing with the natural gas boom, if you will, we're getting a lot of liquids. You talk about dehydrogenation or what's the word? Hydration, thank you. And so we're seeing ethanes and methanes, we're seeing propanes and butanes, and a lot of that is being able to be taken out. So we also get a side market. This is not just about the crude per se. And if we think that, am I correct in saying that had we been able to have all these pipelines in place and supplying propane, for example, to the Northeast, more so this past winter, that they'd have had a bit more of a comfortable heating season, economically speaking? Is that fair to say?
Well, I would be cautious about that because typically you don't build pipelines to peak because then you've got unutilized infrastructure 90% of the time. Propane historically has been distributed by truck, not by pipeline.
Well, I know they've got to get it close so that they can distribute it, but that would have helped.
But the issue this winter was it was a record cold winter. I mean, that has to be recognized in that somewhere in the context of this.
Right.
So.
Well, there are those who tell you that the climate is changing, and I agree with that. I think it changes 4 times a year, but nonetheless. And so you wouldn't argue with the fact that people over in the Ukraine would rather be buying our natural gas and conceivably our oil than they would be getting energy from Russia, right?
At the moment, yeah, but I think in general they'd just be happy buying something that was low cost and available.
As would Japan and some of the others. Yeah. So, all right, well, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair recognizes ranking member.
Yeah, I don't know if we're planning to do another round, but I've just got a question or two. I'd point out on the idea of the Ukraine, they can't afford to pay Russia $10 a unit. Japan pays us or is paying 16. So if we were exporting natural gas, the Japanese would be offering far more than the Ukrainians could afford to pay, unless we want to tax the American people more so that we can provide a $6 a unit. I have 1 or 2 questions for Ms. Gordon. The first is, let's say we go ahead and we export everything without limits. Then there's another 1973, and we want to hoard what we've got. Will we have the infrastructure to process the oil we produce and use it ourselves if we spend a decade exporting what we export, what the market says to export, importing what the market says to import?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because the more that the market's constrained here with these different and new oils coming out of the ground, the more we're going to think about infrastructure solutions for those here. If it's more profitable to just offshore them, then Saudi Arabia is going to build the refining infrastructure capacity, which is what they're trying to do. The Middle East is getting into refining big time. So, you know, in a way, it's a prize, too. Of course, it's economic to unload it as a producer, but there's a prize here in terms of figuring out how to do it. And that is a question. We will lose that ground when we export.
Prevail the chairman to ask me to let you ask just one question. The dream of environmentalists I know is that the tar sands of Canada are never exploited. There are those who say they'll build the pipeline, the Keystone. The environmentalists think they can stop that. There are those who say the Canadians will go east or west. There are Canadian environmentalists who are in touch with my California environmentalists who think they can stop that. How uneconomic is it to put that Canadian oil into tanker cars, take it on railroads to a U.S. domestic pipeline, and then have it proceed? In other words, if the environmentalists stop the Keystone pipe, stop any pipeline, any Canadian pipeline, and they stop any international U.S. pipeline, can domestic U.S. pipelines bring that oil to market economically, although at lower profits to those who own the tar sands?
Well, it's pretty powerful. You know, the investments up there, at least for the mined bitumen, which has all been invested, it wants to get out, and it will do so at a lower profit if it means, you know, mothballing everything that's ready to get out there. So right now it's moving by rail. I think it's Valero. Can't remember someone's put in a variance actually that would take rail bit, which is the slightly diluted bitumen that you put on rail, and then it would just put it right onto a tanker, so it would come through. The variance would be, is this even U.S. oil? I mean, are we just exporting foreign oil out of Texas by putting Canadian oil unprocessed?
Bottom line, that Canadian oil, those tar sands will be exploited. If it's inefficiently on tanker cars, it's still more economic than leaving that tar sand in the ground. And do I have that right?
Yes, for the mined bitumen, which is about 20% of the resource, because all of that investment's been made. Big question mark for the in situ, the really deep bitumen that they'd have to heat out of the ground. It might be that investments aren't made if it's difficult to move it to market. And then the big question about the oil sands is, what do you do with the bottom of the barrel? If we could think of a way to get rid of that petcoke, the bottom of the barrel, they really wouldn't be that different from any other oil. It's just that they have a very large bottom of the barrel.
The environmentalists I know are opposed to any
well, I'll just add a comment to that, you know, as the debate about Keystone has raged, oil sands production has increased.
The difference in price to ship crude by rail versus pipeline from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico is only about $6 a barrel, $5–6 a barrel. That isn't going to go into the producer's decision-making of whether or not to develop incremental oil sands capacity.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back his time. I want to thank our four witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, can I follow that up?
No, you're not recognized. The Chair appreciates all four of you being here and working with you, and I want to thank the staff on both sides for getting us excellent expert witnesses on this issue, and look forward to talking to you as we progress on legislation, if any. Committee's adjourned.